The hull of the Eidolon screamed like a dying animal as a section of the forward plating tore away, scattering molten fragments into the black void. Darian Holt's eyes snapped open to the strobing red of emergency lights, the air thick with the acrid sting of burning insulation. The control deck shuddered under him, consoles sparking, displays cracked and leaking pale light. Somewhere beneath the din, the ship's synthetic voice cut through, flat and precise. OXYGEEN. Critical. Crew. Status. All deceased. He forced himself upright, his ribs protesting, and blinked through the haze at the ruined bridge. The flight crew lay slumped in their restraints, lifeless. The inertial dampers had failed. He could feel the crushing pull of an uncontrolled descent dragging him deeper into the seat. Through the fractured viewport, the stars spun wildly, then vanished entirely as a wall of blackness swallowed the view. His mind tried to grasp it. No light, no glimmer, not even the faint glow of starlight. The navigational overlay stuttered before dying, but he'd already guessed where they were headed. Nix Prime. A dead world locked in eternal night, no sunlight reaching its surface for eons. Not on any shipping route, not on any rescue schedule. No one came here by accident and lived. Flames rolled across the aft corridor, the heat pushing him forward toward the main controls. His fingers danced over them out of instinct, even as most systems spat back dead responses. Fuel containment ruptured. The Eidolon was bleeding fire into the void. His only thought was to keep her together long enough to land. If you could call smashing into an uncharted rock landing. The ship lurched, artificial gravity surging into chaos, throwing him hard against the restraints. A chime cut through the chaos, unnervingly calm. "Darian," the voice said. "Lyra, the ship's AI." Still online in the core despite the damage. Picking up multiple narrowband emissions from the surface. The frequencies matched predatory communication patterns. "Unknown species." He wiped blood from his brow, eyes narrowing. "You're telling me they're waiting for us to fall?" "Correction," Lyra replied, her voice clinical. "They are not waiting. They are summoning each other. Converging." For a moment, the background noise of the dying ship faded, replaced by something far more primal. It began as a low tremor in the hull, not from impact or turbulence, but from sound deep. Resonant pulses echoing through the Eidolon's structure. The readings flickered on a surviving panel, but he didn't need numbers. He could feel it, the way his bones thrummed in sympathy. The calls were inhuman, layered, voices built for darkness and hunting. He'd heard war drums on shattered moons, siege sirens on glassed worlds, the mournful wails of dying atmospheres, but nothing like this. These weren't warnings, they were invitations. The forward stabilizers tore free, sending the ship into a slow roll. The black below became textured, jagged ridges, yawning chasms, faint movements against the absence of light. The sensors were gone, but his mind supplied the rest. Shapes too large to be wind or debris, pacing beneath the ship's descent vector. "Impact in 112 seconds, Lyra intoned. "Options!" His voice was flat, automatic, the calm of a man long practiced in suppressing panic. Minimal. Emergency thrusters for course adjustment. Hull integrity compromised. Survival probability under 4%. He snorted. "I've worked with worse." The deck juddered, something outside raking across the outer shell. Metal shrieked and split. Fire suppression systems coughed feebly, unable to choke the blaze in the starboard corridor. The sound from below grew clearer, less like distant thunder and more like distinct overlapping patterns. It wasn't random noise. Darian's training, long buried under years of commercial duty, kicked in. Wartime instincts catalogued the cadence, the rises and drops, the harmonic spikes. This was language, not one meant for negotiation. "Lyra," he said, eyes fixed on the void below. "Open external mics, full gain." A burst of static, then clarity, dozens of voices, perhaps hundreds, calling and answering in an intricate lattice. Some were close, some far, but all moved toward a center, toward him. "You hear that?" he asked. "I am recording," Lyra said. Patterns indicate hierarchical signaling, alpha tones present. The ship screamed again as the atmosphere, or whatever passed for it here, clawed at the ruptured hull. The gravity gradient shifted violently, throwing debris across the deck. Darian stayed locked in, watching the black planet's surface expand to fill the viewport. "Impact in 53 seconds. The calls from below shifted pitch, growing sharper, more urgent. He imagined the creatures clustered beneath their invisible sky, sensing the falling star that was his ship, the way wolves might scent blood in the wind. The hull vibrated in sympathy, the sound finding every loose panel, every resonant cavity. "They know exactly where we're coming down," he said. "Yes," Lyra replied. "They are positioning for interception." He let out a slow breath, the firelight dancing in his peripheral vision. Then let's not disappoint them. Another shudder tore through the Eidolon, the remains of the port wing shearing away. Flames trailed behind like a dying comet's tail, briefly illuminating the jagged landscape below. For the first time he caught a glimpse. Not details, just silhouettes of the things that waited. Long limbs, too many joints, spines like antennae raking the air, eyes that caught even the faintest glint of fire, impact in 21 seconds. He gripped the controls, not to change the outcome, but to face it head on. The planet's darkness seemed to reach upward, swallowing the dying light of the Eidolon. In the instant before they struck, a sound rolled up from the depths, not the layered chorus he'd been hearing, but a single, massive roar. It was low enough to vibrate the fillings in his teeth, high enough to make his skin crawl. It wasn't a warning, it wasn't a threat, it was a welcome. And as the Eidolon slammed into Nix Prime's surface, the roar echoed through the steel bones of the ship, following him into the darkness. Darian Holt moved through the wreckage like a man threading his way across a minefield. Every step calculated, every sound measured. The remains of the Eidolon still hissed and groaned behind him, the cooling metal exhaling into the darkness of Nix Prime. His boots crunched over glassy fragments of viewport, the only remnants of the bridge where he had watched his crew die without a single chance to save them. He didn't look back. Regret was a sound he knew too well, and he had spent years training himself not to listen. At 38, he was no stranger to war zones, but this place had a weight unlike any battlefield he'd walked. The air pressed against his ears with a faint, almost imperceptible vibration, the hum of a world that had never known light. He set the portable camp's tripod emitters into the hard, uneven ground, watching their faint blue arcs form a perimeter more symbolic than effective. Beyond it, the blackness was absolute, a curtain that refused to yield detail even at close range. In the army, he had been a sound warfare specialist, a title that didn't mean much until the enemy was using noise to break your will. Darian had been better at it than most, not because of training, but because of the way his brain worked. He could sense patterns in frequencies others couldn't hear, mimic them perfectly, and bend them toward whatever end he needed. During the Orion Reclamation campaign, he had used those skills to draw enemy squads into ambushes without firing a shot. That had been before. Before the day an operation went wrong, one bad order, one miscalculation, and his entire unit was erased in minutes. He'd lived, the kind of survival that felt more like a sentence than a reprieve. They stripped his rank, reassigned him to civilian security aboard trade routes, a quiet exile that kept him far from command, and even farther from anyone who might depend on him. Darian hadn't minded. Distance kept people alive. Now there was no one to keep alive but himself. He unlatched a case from the emergency pack, unfolding a parabolic receiver and positioning it toward the unseen horizon. "Lyra," he said, his voice low, "give me a surface scan." Static hissed for a moment, then the AI's voice came through the helmet comms, cool and unwavering. Multiple biological signatures detected. Range, 100 to 300 meters. Count, 43 and increasing. Movement pattern, circular. He glanced toward the dark. "Hunting, encircling," Lyra replied. "They are maintaining consistent distance, adjusting speed to match your movements." Darian adjusted the receiver's frequency sweep, and faint noises began to emerge, clicks, elongated warbles, short bursts of sub-bass thumps that seemed to vibrate the back of his skull. The calls overlapped, shifting in rhythm like some predatory chorus. His brow furrowed. "Not random." "No," Lyra confirmed. "Patterns are structured. This is communication." He knelt beside the receiver, fingers running over its controls with the same precision he might have used on a rifle. His mind dissected the sounds, isolating individual strands, identifying the hierarchy embedded within. The deeper tones carried authority, the sharper bursts commanded movement, the layered harmonics served as coordination. He'd heard this kind of structure before, in wolf packs, in coordinated drone swarms, in the voice channels of disciplined soldiers. Only this wasn't mechanical. "You can replicate them," Lyra said after a pause. He looked up toward the invisible horizon. "And pretend to be prey or a predator. That would depend on your accuracy," she replied. "And your intent." Darian exhaled slowly, running a hand over the short stubble on his jaw. The perimeter emitters pulsed faintly around him, marking a circle of fragile safety. 43 signatures and climbing. At this rate, by the time the portable distress beacon had enough power to send a transmission, they'd be inside his line. He didn't need to ask what happened then. He'd seen enough torn bodies to imagine the rest. He moved to the wreck and retrieved the portable modulation rig, a battered field unit from his military days, repurposed over the years for less dangerous work. Setting it down beside the receiver, he began linking inputs, matching Lyra's analysis to the synthesizer's output. "What do you make of their spacing?" he asked. "They are keeping you at the center of a shifting radius," she said. "No direct approach yet." "Scouting," Darien muttered. "Waiting for a signal." A low pulse rolled in from the distance, so deep it almost escaped hearing, but he felt it in his bones. It was followed by a sudden tightening of the circle, the signatures closing a few meters before resuming their pacing. His hands worked faster on the rig, adjusting dials with muscle memory that hadn't dulled despite the years. Lyra's voice softened, almost as if she understood what he was thinking. "You can speak back to them." The thought hung in the air like the scent of rain before a storm. It was dangerous, reckless, and exactly the kind of move that might shift the balance between being surrounded and being obeyed. Darien looked toward the dark and imagined eyes, watching, muscles coiled, waiting for some cue to act. He remembered the last time he'd stood in the middle of an enemy formation, the cold hum of a comm unit against his ear, the knowledge that the next words from his mouth could save or doom everyone with him. Back then, he'd chosen wrong. Back then, people had died. His fingers hovered over the activation switch. "If I talk to them," he said quietly, "I'm in their game." "You're already in it," Lyra answered. He allowed himself the faintest smile, grim but real. "Then let's see if I can still play." The rig powered on with a low hum, lights chasing one another across its battered surface. He tuned to match the last dominant call, feeling the vibrations settle into the right timbre, the right pitch. When he spoke, it wasn't words, but a sound that carried weight, authority, and the subtle threat of something that could not be ignored. For a moment, the circle paused. The pacing stopped. The night seemed to listen. Darien adjusted the tone, adding a harmonic lift, the equivalent of a challenge. From somewhere deep in the dark, an answer came, not closer, not retreating, but acknowledging. He leaned back, his mind already mapping the possibilities. Prey was dead the moment it was noticed. Predators survived. Leaders ruled. On Nix Prime in the eternal dark, he would have to decide which one he would be before the circle closed. The modulation rig hummed under Darien's hands, a low, steady vibration that seemed to seep into the ground. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting his hearing reach beyond the camp's weak perimeter lights, past the whisper of cooling metal from the wreckage into the vast black ocean of Nix Prime's night. The patterns were there, layered frequencies, clicks and subharmonics woven together into a tapestry of sound that marked the presence of the Shadowrunners. He tuned the rig with surgical precision, his voice sliding into the pitch and timbre of the dominant alpha. Cole, he'd isolated earlier. The output was flawless. The tone rolled out into the dark like a living thing, deep and resonant, carrying authority. At first, the black remained still. Then, movement. A faint ripple of sound and motion shifted the air, and the receiver lit up with signatures drawing closer. Darien kept his breathing slow, steady, holding the alpha call without a waver. Shapes emerged at the very edge of his hearing, slender, multi-limbed creatures gliding soundlessly between jagged rocks. The Shadowrunners came in a loose arc, not rushing, not hiding, simply moving with the confidence of predators in their own domain. One broke from the formation, slipping closer with a predator's measured grace. Darien felt its focus lock onto him, a cold line of intent in the air. He didn't blink. Instead, he pushed a fraction more dominance into the call, adding a subtle drop in frequency that marked territory. The creature hesitated, head cocking at an angle he could feel rather than see. Another second passed. Then it eased back into the circle, the silent retreat as significant as a bow. A flicker of satisfaction passed through him, quickly buried. Control was fragile. Break it for even a second, and the pack would turn. Lyra's voice came through the comm, quiet but edged with calculation. Response rate consistent with submission patterns. "You have their attention." Before he could answer, a new sound bled into the mix, harsh, metallic, entirely alien to the flowing cadence of the Shadowrunner's language. A triple pulse screech, followed by a shrill oscillation that grated across the edges of hearing. The effect was immediate. The pack faltered, their formation fracturing. Calls overlapped in confusion, some high with alarm, others jagged with challenge. Darien's alpha tone wavered as their frequencies shifted unpredictably. He swung the receiver toward the source and caught the movement, sleek, angular forms moving low across the terrain. The Vorik, scavengers and poachers, their long limbs folded tight for speed, their torsos bristling with audio projectors. He'd seen them once before in a border world, harvesting the luminous glands of a native species to sell in off-world markets. The Shadowrunners' bioluminescent spinal nodes would fetch a fortune. The Vorik deployed their traps with unnerving speed, tripod emitters that pulsed, disorienting blasts of sound. Each pulse made Darian's teeth ache and the Shadowrunners shudder, their echolocation unraveling. His rig's readout spiked erratically, the alpha tone losing its grip. Lyra's voice came sharp now. If they take the pack, you lose your shield. The Vorik will leave nothing alive. Darian's eyes tracked the scavengers as they closed in, their weapons snapping open. Shaped charges ready to drop the first runner and draw the rest into the kill zone. And if I stop them, he said, we light up like a beacon. The whole planet will know where we are. Your options narrow by the second, Lyra replied. The rig squealed as a trap's pulse collided with his modulation, feedback clawing at his eardrums. Darian gritted his teeth, switching frequencies on instinct, looking for a gap between the Vorik bursts and the runner's panic calls. It was like threading a needle during an earthquake. He found it, brief, narrow, a space between the pulses where his voice could slip through. He dropped the tone low, deeper than before, layering it with a pattern he'd once used to rally a squad under artillery fire. It wasn't exactly the Shadowrunner's language, but it carried the same weight come to me. The nearest runner froze mid-stride, then swung toward him. Another followed, and another. The Vorik noticed, their formation shifting to cut the creatures off, but Darian was already amplifying, reinforcing the call until it rolled through the night like the slow heartbeat of something immense. The pack regrouped, their confusion fading into a coordinated arc between him and the scavengers. The Vorik didn't back off. They spread out instead, projectors wailing in counterpoint, trying to fracture the fragile link Darian had built. A trap burst too close, static ripping through his signal. Pain knifed behind his eyes. Darian, Lyra pressed. They're adapting. Then so will we, he growled, fingers flying over the rig's controls. He bled harmonics into the alpha call, weaving in the runner's own alarm patterns, turning fear into aggression. The pack's posture changed instantly. They lowered their bodies, spines arching, movement shifting from measured to predatory. The Vorik hesitated for the first time, their projectors faltering as the Shadowrunners surged forward in a unified wave. The scavengers opened fire, sonic bursts slamming into the charging pack, but the momentum was too great. Darian cut his core mid-note, letting the runner's own voices take over, their roars rising to fill the void. Through the static and the chaos, Lyra's voice came again, quieter this time. They'll kill the Vorik, but once they're done... I know, Darian said, watching the battle ignite in the darkness. They'll remember who led them there, and in the back of his mind, another thought took root. One more dangerous than the Vorik, more dangerous than the pack. If he could lead them once, he could do it again. But to keep that control, he'd have to step fully into their world and never step back. The wounded runner's cry cut through the night, a jagged, broken sound that carried pain and panic in equal measure. Darian caught it instantly, dissecting its structure in his mind, hearing not just the tone, but the way it bent under strain. He dropped to one knee beside the modulation rig, fingers moving fast over the controls, feeding his own voice into the signal, amplifying it, bending it until it wasn't just one cry, but a chorus ripple that traveled outward in every direction. The effect was immediate. From the dark, scattered shapes shifted course, abandoning their cautious pacing for a headlong sprint toward the source. The pack was coming. The Vorik didn't hesitate the moment they sensed the surge. Their weapons sang, plasma bursts spitting blue fire into the black, each discharge momentarily painting the nightmare terrain in stark relief. Jagged spires of rock loomed like the teeth of some ancient predator. The runners wove between them, their movements fluid, almost liquid, ghosting through the shadows without sound. Darian moved with them, his own steps silent, body low, using the bursts of light to gauge positions before darkness swallowed everything again. The soundscape was chaos, clicks, roars, subharmonics that thrummed in his ribs. Vorik trap pulses cracked through it like lightning, each one threatening to fracture his fragile control. But the modulation rig was tuned now, riding the edge between the runner's natural aggression and his guiding rhythm. Every shift in tone was a command, every drop in frequency a signal to close in, every rising pulse a cue to strike. A Vorik scout broke from cover to flank. Darian pivoted, voice dropping into a guttural command note. Two runners peeled from the pack instantly, their spines glowing faintly with bioelectric charge, and hit the alien like a pair of living spears. The plasma fire stuttered as the Vorik went down. His projector crushed under claw and bone. The pack adapted fast. They began to move as one organism, the space between Darian's calls and their responses shrinking until it felt less like leadership and more like shared instinct. He could feel the tempo of the fight as much as hear it, each pulse of sound driving them forward, each scream of a dying Vorik feeding their frenzy. Then the tone of the battle shifted. A sound unlike any other rolled in from the north, low, layered, and impossibly strong. It resonated in the bones, in the ground itself, a sound that wasn't just heard, but inhabited. Darian didn't need Lyra to tell him what it was. "The Alpha," she confirmed anyway, her voice quieter than usual. The massive shape emerged from the dark like a mountain learning to walk. Taller than any runner he had seen, its spines arched like the ridges of a cathedral roof, each one faintly luminescent. It moved without hurry, each step deliberate. The other runners slowed, their focus breaking from the Vorik entirely. Every head turned toward the newcomer. Darian's voice almost faltered. He'd been posing as an alpha, but this was the real thing. The newcomer released a sequence of notes, fast, complex, a linguistic labyrinth of harmonics and modulations that tested not just dominance, but identity. It was a challenge, one designed to strip away imposters and pretenders. He knew the stakes without needing them spelled out. If he failed to answer correctly, the pack would turn on him in an instant. Lyra's voice slid into his ear, calm but urgent. "Your vocal range can't replicate that complexity unaided. You need augmentation." He was already moving. The wreck of the Eidolon loomed behind the skirmish, its scorched frame glowing faintly in the dark from dying embers. Darian sprinted for it, weaving through the fringes of the battle, the modulation rig slung over his shoulder. Inside the shattered hull, the air was thick with heat and a smell of scorched alloy. He reached the engineering bay's remains, where the auxiliary core still pulsed faintly with stored power. "Lyra, interface the rig with the core's harmonic drivers," he said, already pulling cabling free. "That level of low-frequency output will destabilize the casing," she warned. "Won't matter if I'm dead," he shot back. The connection hissed as it locked. Darian tuned the output, combining the Alpha's dominant frequencies with a sub-bass tone the runners could feel more than hear. It was deeper than anything their bodies could naturally produce, a tectonic growl that seemed to come from the planet itself. He stepped back into the night, his chest vibrating with the force of it, and answered the challenge. The sound rolled out like a shockwave, folding around the Alpha's test and consuming it. For a heartbeat, there was only silence. Then the pack moved, not toward him in aggression, but around him, reforming their arc with him at the center. Even the Alpha tilted its head, a slow, deliberate gesture that could have been acknowledgement or submission. "You're not leading them," Lyra said, her tone somewhere between awe and warning. "You're deceiving them." "In war," Darian replied, eyes on the Vorik regrouping in the distance, "deception is just another form of survival." He shifted the frequency again, this time into a tempo that drove forward momentum. The pack surged with him, their speed blinding in the dark, their movements synchronized with his every modulation. They hit the Vorik line like a living storm, plasma fire vanishing into snarls and the wet sound of tearing metal and flesh. The scavengers tried to fall back, but the runners moved in perfect concert, cutting off escape routes before they existed. Darian wove through them like a conductor in the middle of his orchestra, every note pulling the battle tighter around the Vorik until there was nowhere left to run. One last trap pulse burst nearby, its dissonant scream almost knocking him off his rhythm. The Alpha runner answered it with a roar that shattered the air, a wall of sound so massive it drowned out the chaos for a second. Darian caught the moment and amplified it, feeding it back into the pack's chorus until it became a single, unified voice, a predator's victory cry. When the last Vorik fell, the silence that followed was almost more dangerous. The pack stood breathing in unison, their attention shifting back to him. Darian held the frequency steady, letting dominance and calm bleed into the tone. Slowly, the tension eased. The Alpha stepped forward, massive head lowering until its spines were level with his eyes. It studied him for a long moment, then released a short, low pulse. "Acknowledgement!" Darian let the tone fade, his body aching from the strain, his throat raw. But the pack didn't disperse. They lingered, waiting. And in that stillness, he realized he hadn't just survived the challenge. He'd taken something far more dangerous. Control. The first sign that the Vorik had returned was the silence. It wasn't the natural stillness of Nyx Prime's endless night, but an abrupt, surgical absence of sound that pressed against the skin like a vacuum. Darian froze mid-step, every instinct warning him that something was wrong. The runners around him hesitated too, their spines twitching as if searching for a signal they could no longer find. Then it hit. A low-frequency pulse so perfectly tuned it stripped the air of orientation. It was the Vorik's sound kill tech, a weapon designed to blind anything that hunted or navigated by echo. The pack staggered, some dropping to the ground, others spinning in tight, frantic circles as if trapped in invisible nets. Even Darian's own balance wavered. His ears and brain screamed different locations for the same sound. Through the haze of disorientation, Lyra's voice came sharp and clinical. Multiple Vorik signatures closing fast, they deployed wide-area nullification fields. If they encircle us, the pack will tear itself apart before they even fire a shot. Darien grit his teeth, pressing a hand to the modulation rig slung across his chest. Every signal he sent out now died the moment it left the emitter, smothered by the Vorik's tech. He scanned the dark, catching brief, phantom flashes of their angular silhouettes as they darted from cover to cover. They were herding him just as they were herding the runners, tightening the net for the kill. "I have an option," Lyra said, her voice level, as if presenting a simple, tactical calculation. "We can route the auxiliary core's remaining energy into a single, ultra-high frequency burst. It will incapacitate everything within a 2-kilometer radius, Vorik and runners alike. You will be safe for approximately 7 minutes before the Vorik recover." He didn't need her to explain the catch. "And in those 7 minutes, I'll be standing alone in the middle of a silent killing field," he muttered. "Yes," Lyra confirmed. "Without the pack, survival probability drops to—" "Don't," Darien snapped, his voice low but hard. He didn't want the number. He already knew it would be bad enough to make even a soldier flinch. Around him, the runners were breaking formation entirely, colliding with one another, snapping in confusion. The Vorik pulses were stripping them of the coordination he built, unraveling the fragile chain of trust and deception that had held them together. If the pack fractured completely, they wouldn't just fail to defend him, they might turn on him as the nearest perceived threat. Lyra spoke again, softer this time. "If you use the burst, you survive the moment. Without it, the Vorik will grind you down along with them. You need to decide now." Darien's gaze swept the battlefield, the Vorik tightening their formation, their emitters flaring with each pulse, the Alpha Runner swaying, fighting to keep its balance, the younger predators keening in blind panic. This was no longer about control. It was about whether the pack and everything he'd risked to claim it meant anything, more than a temporary shield. He let the thoughts settle for one heartbeat, then shook his head. "No," he said, "I'm not killing them to buy myself time." "You choose to die with them?" Lyra asked, not with judgment, but with the weight of someone logging the final entry of a doomed mission. "I choose to win," Darien said, his tone steady, "or die while still being the one they follow." Even with the null field smothering his tools, he still had one advantage. The Vorik tech operated on a range, and ranges had limits. The closer he got to the emitters, the less saturation each could maintain. But closing meant entering the kill zone of scavengers armed for more than sound. He slung the rig around to his back, signaling to the Alpha with the only physical cue he had left, posture. He lowered himself, shoulders forward, gaze fixed on the Vorik line. The Alpha stilled, watching him. Slowly, it mimicked the stance. One by one, the runners followed, their bodies aligning, instincts overriding disorientation. It was enough. He broke into a sprint. The pack surged with him, not in perfect formation, but with raw, violent intent. The Vorik reacted instantly, their pulses doubling, the air vibrating like a living wall. Darien's vision blurred, his knees threatening to fold, but he forced himself forward, cutting toward the closest emitter. Plasma fire hissed past, lighting the rocks in brief, unnatural daylight. He hit the first Vorik like a battering ram, shoulder slamming into its narrow torso, knocking it from its tripod projector. The Alpha crashed into another, claws raking metal and bone. Without the projector, the null bubble flickered, and sound rushed back into that slice of the field like a flood. Darien tore the modulation rig forward and, without pause, unleashed a guttural call, a raw, primal command note reinforced with every ounce of authority he had left. The freed runners responded instantly, their own cries joining his. "Ah!" The sound spread like a contagion, slipping into the cracks of the Vorik formation as more emitters went down under tooth and claw. Pockets of chaos bloomed, each one widening as the pack tore at the devices, reasserting their dominance over the soundscape. The Vorik fought back hard. One slammed the shock pike into Darien's side, the jolt dropping him to a knee. He answered by driving the rig's emitter into its chest and blasting a concentrated burst at point-blank range. The alien spasmed, fell, and the pack descended. With each projector destroyed, the battlefield shifted. Disorientation gave way to rhythm again, staggered at first, then building into the synchronized momentum he'd forged earlier. The Alpha's roar cut through the night, not the challenge tone from before, but something deeper, a declaration of war. Darien amplified it with the rig, adding a sub-bass growl that turned the air into a weapon. The Vorik line collapsed under the assault. Some tried to retreat, dragging emitters with them, but the pack was faster, running them down before they could reset their fields. The fight dissolved into a storm of motion and sound, a war of echoes where every note and pulse became a blade. When the last Vorik fell, the battlefield was littered with broken emitters and shattered armor. The pack stood breathing hard, their glowing spines casting faint halos in the dark. Darien lowered the rig, chest heaving, sweat chilling on his skin. Lyra's voice returned, quieter now. "Your survival probability just improved." He managed a grim smile. "Told you! Win or die as their leader." The Alpha stepped close, head lowering until its eyes met his. In that silent exchange, Darien felt something shift. Not trust, not exactly, but an understanding. In the chaos of Nyx Prime, leadership wasn't claimed by blood alone. It was taken in the moments when no one else would stand. And for now, at least, he still stood. The night was still ringing from the last echoes of battle. The Vorik lay scattered across the blackened ground, their bodies twisted amid shattered emitters and scorched rock. The Shadowrunners stood over them, spines dimming from the fever-bright glow of combat to a slow, steady pulse. Steam rose from their bodies in the cold air. Darien stood at the center of it all, the modulation rig hanging heavy against his chest, his breath a ragged mist. The Alpha moved first. It stepped forward with the deliberate weight of a creature that had never been challenged and rarely acknowledged equals. Its eyes, pools of reflected starlight, locked on Darien. The pack's low growls faded into a tense, expectant silence. Darien didn't flinch. He let his shoulders square and his breathing slow, refusing to drop his gaze. The Alpha closed the distance, each step almost soundless, until its muzzle was inches from him. It lowered its massive head and touched its nose lightly to his chest plate. The gesture was brief, almost imperceptible, but it carried more meaning than any sound could convey. Acceptance. Not as a master, perhaps not even as a leader in the way humans understood it, but as part of the pack. Around them, the runners exhaled in unison, the collective release of tension almost as loud as their earlier war cries. Darien felt the weight of it settle over him, not a crown, but a mantle. For now, they would move with him, fight with him, perhaps even die with him. In the language of Nyx Prime's eternal dark, there was no stronger bond. He turned toward the wreck of the Eidolon, its jagged silhouette barely visible beyond the ridge. His boots crunched over broken Vorik armor as he made his way back, the Alpha pacing at his side like a silent shadow. The battle had given him control of the ground, but it had cost him something more precious than he wanted to admit. Inside the shattered hull, the emergency lighting was little more than a faint red pulse. Sparks dripped from ruptured conduits like fireflies drowning in slow motion. Lyra's voice came through the calm, softer than he'd ever heard it. Power reserves, 1%. Non-essential systems, shutting down. He stopped at the core housing, resting a hand on the battered casing. "How long?" "Minutes," she said, and even the artificial cadence of her voice seemed to falter. Darien scanned the debris around him until his eyes caught the faint, cold glow of a Vorik spinal crystal. The scavengers had carried them in pouches, each one harvested from a dead runner. He picked one up, its surface warm from residual bioelectric charge, and studied the way the light pulsed faintly inside it, like a heartbeat. "Can you transfer into this?" he asked. Lyra hesitated. "Compression required. I will lose. Non-critical data. What stays? Core functions, tactical archives. Voice. Good enough." He knelt by the crystal, opening a compartment in the modulation rig and running a thin cable to. The Vorik tech embedded inside it. The glow brightened as Lyra's processes began transferring, her voice flickering with distortion. "You are not the man who boarded this ship." A small, involuntary smile touched his lips. "No, I'm not. You don't run any more," she said, the faintest trace of warmth in the failing signal. "No," he replied, securing the crystal in a leather thong and looping it around his neck. "Now I lead." The last of her voice faded into the steady pulse of the crystal, leaving only the faint hum of its stored energy. He stood there for a long moment, hand closing around it like a promise. Somewhere in the dark, he would find a power source. Somewhere, he'd wake her again. Outside, the pack waited. The Alpha stood at the forefront, its silhouette framed by the slow drift of Nyx Prime's perpetual night fog. Darien stepped out of the wreck, and the runners shifted subtly, making space for him without breaking formation. The gesture was instinctive, not commanded. He took in the horizon, what passed for one here. The black stretched forever, broken only by the jagged teeth of distant ridges. Somewhere beyond them, Vorik survivors would be regrouping, or worse, sending signals off-world. The pack's acceptance came with a responsibility he couldn't ignore. He adjusted the rig on his chest, feeling the crystal rest against the sternum. Trust, he realized, wasn't something you could take. It was something you had to keep earning, moment after moment, step after step, until it became the ground you stood on. And here, on Nyx Prime, trust was more valuable than any weapon. The Alpha glanced back at him, a silent question in its posture. Darien answered by moving forward, not looking back at the wreckage. The pack flowed with him, their footfalls vanishing into the endless dark, their spines casting faint halos of light that marked their passage. Somewhere deep in the night, a distant sound answered, a new call, unfamiliar and sharp. The Alpha's head lifted, ears twitching toward it. Darien felt the shift ripple through the pack, the change in their breathing, the tightening of their muscles. Another hunt was beginning, another threat to face. His hand closed over the crystal one more time, the faint warmth grounding him. "All right," he murmured, voice low but steady. "Let's show them who owns the dark." The pack surged forward, shadows within shadows, the sound of their passage swallowed by the black. Darien ran with them, every step carrying him deeper into the world he'd chosen, not as an intruder, not as prey, but as something far more dangerous. They called him the Pack Caller. The name spread along the border stations first, passed in hushed tones between freighter crews and patrol officers who had seen too many dead ships drift in from Nyx Prime's gravity well. At first it was just a rumor, a human who had somehow lived where no one did, who walked with the planet's most feared predators as if he belonged among them. But rumors had a way of sticking out here, far from the core worlds, and with each retelling the story grew until it became a kind of living myth. For some, it was a warning. Nyx Prime changes you. For others, it was a promise. Survival isn't about what you carry, but who walks beside you. Darien Holt had no interest in correcting the details. Truth was heavier than myth, and it was his alone to bear. In the weeks after the Varrock fell silent, the world's eternal night seemed to settle into a new rhythm. The Shadowrunners no longer tracked him as prey. They moved with him, not bound by command, but drawn by a bond forged in battle and blood. The Alpha kept close, sometimes ahead, sometimes pacing alongside him, its glowing spines casting thin arcs of light against the basalt cliffs. Darien moved easily among them now, matching their silence, reading their posture without thought. In the black wilderness of Nyx Prime, they were his shield and his signal. It wasn't technology that had kept him alive. His modulation rig was scarred and patched, running on jury-rigged connections and scavenged parts. His weapons were limited, his supplies dwindling. But the pack, that was different. They were not a tool to be used. They were an alliance, hard-earned and precarious, built on something no Vorek emitter or human warship could replicate. Trust. He remembered the recording he'd made before leaving the wreck, not for anyone in particular, but for himself, something to hold on to if the night finally took him. He'd spoken into the rig's mic, his voice low and even. If the only ally you have is a monster, learn its language before you try to command it. True strength is making the one who once sought your death choose to. Fight at your side. He'd paused then, not for effect, but because the thought that followed was the one that mattered most. If survival meant becoming the leader of those who once hunted you, would you do it? That file, stripped of identifiers, had slipped into the border relay somehow. He'd never sent it. Maybe Lyra had, before her voice went silent inside the Vorek crystal he now wore against his chest. Maybe someone who found the wreck had carried it out. It didn't matter. The question had spread with the story, and in the dark corners of the frontier, people argued over it the way they argued about old battles and distant politics. Some said yes without hesitation. Others swore they'd rather die. Darien knew there was no right answer, only the one you could live with afterward. The pack's acceptance had come at a cost. Leading them meant being part of them, understanding the rhythm of their world, the logic of their violence. It meant defending them against anything that threatened their survival, even if that meant putting himself in the jaws of something worse. He had stopped thinking in terms of rescue. Out here, there was no one coming. The line between man and beast blurred in the endless dark, and maybe that was why the Shadowrunners still followed him. He had stepped fully into their world and stopped trying to drag them into his. Tonight, the windless air was heavy with the scent of stone and ozone. Somewhere far off, another pack's call rose, a challenge or perhaps an invitation. The Alpha's ears flicked, but it didn't move until Darien did. He stepped toward the sound, and the rest of the pack flowed with him, their movements a whisper against the rock. The night seemed infinite, the sky a lid of pure black, but the runner's eyes burned like distant stars, each one a point of light in a place where there was no dawn. He thought of Lyra then, her voice in his ear during the fight, the quiet certainty in her last words. "You don't run any more!" She was right. The man who had stumbled out of the Eidolon's wreckage had been trying to outrun his own shadow. The man who stood here now was something else entirely. Not a hero, not a conqueror, but a survivor who had learned that leadership was not about command. It was about standing in the one place no one else would, and staying there until others stood with you. From the ridge ahead, the land dropped away into a sea of jagged stone. Darien climbed it slowly, the Alpha matching his pace. At the top he stopped. The world spread out before him in shades of black, broken only by the faint glimmer of the pack's spines and the cold pulse of the crystal at his neck. The runners gathered around, their breath steaming faintly in the frigid air. He could feel their attention on him, not in submission, but in recognition. Below, the darkness shifted, alive with things moving just beyond the edge of sight. Nyx Prime was still full of dangers, some he knew, others waiting to be named. The Vark would return one day with more ships and better weapons. Other predators would test the pack's strength, and he would meet them all here on this ground with the only allies he had. He closed his hand around the crystal, feeling its faint, stubborn warmth. Somewhere inside it, Lyra's voice slept. One day he'd wake her again. Until then, he carried her like he carried the pack, close to the bone, impossible to set down. The wind shifted, bringing with it the faint echo of that distant call again. Darien looked out into the unbroken dark, then down at the Alpha. "Let's go see who else thinks they own this night," he said, his voice carrying just enough edge to be a promise. The Alpha moved first, stepping toward the drop, and the rest followed in a ripple of motion. Darien went with them, his silhouette framed against the black sky. From a distance, the scene might have looked like a strange constellation taking shape on the ground, a ring of glowing eyes around a lone human, bright against the void, a man who had chosen to lead not by force, but by earning the right to stand among monsters. On Nyx Prime, there would never be a sunrise. But as the pack flowed down into the dark, their eyes blazing, it looked for a moment like he carried his own stars with him.